as you follow the story of Samson, sometimes you don't know whether you should be cheering for him or weeping over him. And of course, the story therefore raises a very relevant question for us. How can a man who is such a gifted believer, so greatly used by God in his purpose, at the same time be such an irresponsible fool?
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. I'm David Pick. I'm glad you could be with us today. And Colin, unfortunately the history of the church is somewhat littered with people and leaders who share some of the characteristics of the story we see here.
Yeah, well, you know, the story we're looking at today really is full of hope, because here's this man who makes such a mess up of so many things. You think, this is a complete disaster. Our series is called Deck Chairs on the Titanic. Well, if ever there was a disaster, it is Samson. And yet, the Spirit of God patiently, graciously was at work in his life. And though there is disaster all around this man, in the New Testament, to our great surprise, he ends up being recorded in the list of heroes of faith. That is astonishing when you think about the mess-ups of his life. So, for the person who's listening to the program today and you have messed up big time, Samson's story is a story of great hope for you, and the light of the gospel just shines through it in the most wonderful way.
So join us today in your Bible, if you can, in Judges chapters 13 through to 16, as we begin the message, Cultivate Self-Control. Here's Colin.
Now, I want you this morning to try and imagine a nightmare scenario. It's hard for us to do this because we've become so used to the freedom that we enjoy and sometimes may take for granted. But I want you to imagine tanks rolling up the streets in Washington. I want you to imagine the unthinkable scenario in which a foreign power has invaded this country and we are no longer a free people. The FBI and the CIA have been taken over. All of the national security apparatus has been dismantled. A foreign army are on the streets of every city, and every day there are atrocities committed by the military on the streets in the loop against defenseless people on their way to work. Various attempts at resistance have been made. But whenever anyone gets involved in something to do with resistance, they disappear and are never heard of again. So gradually over time, resistance crumbles. People begin to accept the unthinkable. We lose hope of ever regaining our freedom. Now, that is the nightmare scenario that applied to God's people at the beginning of Judges in chapter 13. Do you see there that the Lord had delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years? God's people at this time had no army, they had no king, there was no organized resistance movement, and so they were absolutely helpless under the tyranny of a fearful oppressor. The enemy had rolled into the land, and for 40 years, the people of God had been unable to do anything about it. 40 years! That's a whole generation. You think of what 40 years means. You try and picture your children or your grandchildren growing up over a period of 40 years. You've known freedom, but they've never known it since they were born. All they've ever known is the tanks in the streets. And you're now seeing them 20, 30, 38, 39, 40 years old, and you wonder, will they ever know what it is to be free? And you, as you get older, begin to cry out to God. Where is deliverance going to come from? You can't see a hope of it on the horizon. But God heard the prayers of his people, and he answered in the birth of Samson. Now, we need to know three things about Samson before we get into the story so that we can understand it rightly. The first is that Samson was a gifted believer. I say he was a believer because the New Testament specifically tells us that he was a man of faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 lists him along with David and Samuel and Gideon as those who administered justice, conquered kingdoms through faith. He was a man of faith. Not only that, God made it clear before Samson was born that he was to be set apart for a very special purpose for God. Chapter 13 of Judges and verse 5, this boy is to be a Nazirite. He's to be set apart from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, this bit about being a Nazirite was somewhat unusual. You can read about it in Numbers in chapter 6. Basically, when a person wanted to give themselves with a special devotion to God for a period of time or for a particular purpose, they would take a vow in which they would not cut their hair, in which they would abstain from any alcoholic drink, and in which they would not touch nor go near any kind of dead body or carcass. This was in order to keep them ceremonially pure so that they could continually be, as it were, in the presence of God. Now, a Nazirite vow was normally taken for a particular period of time, a few months or whatever, for a special reason. But what was unique about Samson was that this vow applied to the whole of his life. From the moment that he was born, God said, "You're set apart for a particular purpose." And it was for that reason that, unlike any other college student, his mother never once said to him, "Son, go to the barber's and get a haircut." She never said that to him, and so throughout his life, his hair grew. Now notice third, that he was gifted. He was a believer, he was set apart for God, he was unusually gifted by the Holy Spirit. Chapter 13 and verse 24, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. It was the Holy Spirit who gave him this gift of remarkable strength. It was a charisma. It was what we might call a spiritual gift, and it was used to extraordinary effect. So if we're to understand Samson properly, we need to start from what the Bible tells us, that he was a gifted believer, set apart from God, empowered by the Holy Spirit for a special task to which God had called him. Secondly, he was a courageous hero. I think of Samson as the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the Old Testament. He is this larger-than-life hero who comes into a desperate situation and gives hope where everything else seems lost. In this country that is defeated and overrun, here is one man who is ready to put up a fight for the liberation of God's people from their enemies. And he does it with awesome results. But then the third thing to know about Samson is that he was an irresponsible fool. And this is the great irony of this man's life. Here's a man with godly parents, with spiritual gifts, extraordinary courage, and greatly used by God. And yet at times, as we'll see, he does the most stupid things. And so as you follow the story of Samson, sometimes you don't know whether you should be cheering for him or weeping over him. And of course, the story therefore raises a very relevant question for us. How can a man who is such a gifted believer, so greatly used by God in his purpose, at the same time be such an irresponsible fool? How is it possible for a man to be given so much strength by God, and yet at the same time as pursuing a wonderful ministry, make so many foolish mistakes? Now, if you've never seen that contradiction, then you don't live in the same world as I do. Samson speaks right to the heart of the questions that we face today. He reminds us that it is possible to have the gift of the Spirit, that it is possible to be called by God to ministry, that it is possible to be used by God in his kingdom, and to take a plunge to disaster. And there isn't one of us here who wants that to be true of us. And so our purpose today, as we follow the story, is to make sure that we learn from Samson so we don't follow his path.
You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Cultivate Self-Control. It's part of our series, Deck Chairs on the Titanic, where we look at 8 characters from the Bible and how they allowed the sin in their life to result in a plunge to disaster. And if you've missed any of the series, or if you want to go back and listen again, you can do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk, or find us as a podcast by following the link from the website, or by searching in all the main podcast sites for Open the Bible UK. Back to the message now. We're in Judges, chapters 13 through to 16. Here's Colin.
Our purpose today, as we follow the story, is to make sure that we learn from Samson so we don't follow his path. Well, now, as we turn to the story, you have to use your imagination now to picture Samson. This guy's been working out in the weight room for years. When he walks, his muscles ripple under his bronze skin. Are you getting the picture here? His deep-set, dark eyes, and his chiseled features, and his perfectly toned six-pack of abs attract attention wherever he walks. And now that you've got him firmly pictured in your imagination, I want you to see this Old Testament hunk walking down the road to a place called Timnah. And there at the beginning of chapter 14, we're told that Samson sees a Philistine woman. Now, she must have been an absolute stunner, because as soon as Samson saw her, he was absolutely smitten. He comes home, chapter 14 and verse 2, and he says, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. And he says to his mother and father, now get her for me as my wife. Samson's mother and father, of course, are absolutely horrified by this. The Philistines are the enemy who have been oppressing God's people for 40 years. How can you possibly marry the enemy? But Samson had made up his mind. Verse 3 of chapter 14, get her for me, he says. She's the right one for me. Well, talk about the strong-willed child. He's so smitten, he's not listening to anybody else. And of course, as we saw last time, that's the first step on the road to disaster. Now, there may be some parents who can identify with Samson's mother and father at this point today. You've sought to raise the child or children that God has given to you. You've poured yourself into that, and you've done everything you know how to direct them on right paths. But they have a will of their own, and there comes a point as they grow into maturity where you can't stop them. You wish that you could, but you know that you can't. And you can see pain further down the road, and you kind of wince as you think about it. But all that you can do is to live with your pain and to trust that God may do something remarkable to bring good out of it. Now, if that's where you are, this is a wonderfully encouraging story, because God did do something remarkable. And though Samson brought a great deal of self-inflicted pain into his own life, God never let go of him. And through all the tragedies of his life, God wove his foolish decisions into a bigger purpose that God used to advance his kingdom. You find this referred to particularly in chapter 14 and verse 4, where we're told that Samson's parents did not know that this was from the Lord. Now, that does not mean that the Lord validated this marriage. It was a breaking of a principle that God had already given. It was a dreadful mistake, and it led to all kinds of pain. But the good news is that even your most dreadful, foolish, stupid mistake cannot overwhelm the purposes of God. And God has a wonderful way of taking even the stupid mistakes of our lives and weaving them into the wider purpose that he can still accomplish in and through his people. Well, we're going to see that story. Now, it's interesting that it's as they go on the way to Timnah to meet up with this lady for the first time, that Samson has his first experience of the Spirit of God coming on him in power. Chapter 14 and verse 5. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, a young lion came roaring towards Samson. the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. Very interesting. God can bless you even when you're on the wrong path. And God's power came to Samson at this moment in his life. He's attacked by this lion, and to his own absolute astonishment, he finds he has the strength to tear the lion apart limb from limb. He must have been amazed when he saw what he'd done. It happened only because of the direct power of God coming at that moment upon him. But it was a kind of sneak preview of what God would enable him to do in the future. With power like that, all things are possible. Now, sometime later, the family returned for what turned out to be a nightmare of a wedding. Now, lots of people have good stories about things that went wrong in weddings, cakes that fell over and so forth and so on. But this is the mother of all wedding nightmares, I tell you. The family come back, and as they're coming down for the wedding, approaching Timnah, Samson pulls off the road to see if the carcass of the lion he killed is still there. And sure enough, it is. And to his astonishment, some bees have made a hive within the carcass, the bones of this lion. And there's honey there. It must have made Samson laugh. And he made up a little rhyme about it. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, the lion, something sweet. Now, when Samson arrived in Timnah, he was responsible for organizing the wedding reception. And we're told in verse 10 of chapter 14 that he was given 30 companions. Now, I don't know how it is for you when you've had experience perhaps of organizing a wedding, but being told there's an extra 30 guests who you don't know who want to turn up is really not very good news at the last minute, wouldn't you think? Everybody who's ever planned a wedding knows how difficult it is to get the guest list squeezed down to fit the budget. And now here Samson finds that he has to have 30 people who he doesn't even know in his wedding, and he's not at all pleased. I don't know how it was put to him. Perhaps his wife put it something like this. Well, dear, there are already 300 guests on my Philistine side of the family. And of course, there's only you, your mother and father on yours. Only 3 on one side of the church, not very many. I tell you what, we've got some other relatives. Maybe they can come as your guests also. Another 30, they can stand with you. Well, Samson's not at all amused because, of course, he is paying for the wedding. So he decides to have a little bit of fun with the unwanted guests. He tells them the riddle. Out of the eater, something to eat, he says. Out of the strong, something sweet. And then he makes a bet with them. If you can tell me, he says to the 30 unwanted guests, the meaning of this riddle, then I'll pay for your tuxedos. Now, it doesn't actually say tuxedos, but it says suits, and we're talking about a wedding. So, what do you think they would have been? And then he says, but if you can't tell me the meaning of this riddle, you'll be paying your own expenses, which the 30 guests were not too amused about. By the way, if this is a little bit of free advice thrown in for nothing this morning, if you want to promote family harmony, don't play games with your in-laws about who should pay what in the wedding reception. It always leads to trouble, and of course it did here. These wedding celebrations went on for days, and in verse 15, we find that the guests are leaning on Samson's wife to find out the answer. Verse 15, on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle to us, or we'll burn you, some wedding guests, and your father's household to death. Well, this poor woman, fancy being told that by your guests in the middle of your wedding? This woman is desperate. And this is the 4th day of a prolonged kind of celebration. So talk about ruining the honeymoon. Verse 16, Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing. You hate me? You don't really love me? Well, it's a bit rich to start this in the middle of the honeymoon, don't you think? You have given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. And she went on until eventually Samson told her, and she told the guests, and Samson lost the bet and he had to pay for the tuxedos. So Samson's absolutely furious. He goes off and he takes the lives of 30 Philistines, takes their clothes, brings them back to the reception, gives them to the 30 guests, and then stomps off home in a furious rage, leaving his bride stranded at the altar. And if that's not enough of a wedding nightmare for you, then I have to tell you it gets worse afterwards. Because at the beginning of chapter 15, verse 1 there, Samson turns up at his bride's house at Timnah again. He arrives with a bunch of red roses. Well, it doesn't actually say that. Actually, it was a young goat. But the significance is exactly the same. Because what he wants to do is he wants to say he's very sorry about all that happened at the wedding, and he'd very much like to kiss and make up in the bedroom. Look at chapter 15 and verse 1. That's what he says. To his father-in-law, "I'm going to my wife's room," he says. So here's a guy who seems to think that he can walk in and out of a relationship at will, that he can cause all kinds of trouble and sorrow, and then that he can just come back at a moment's notice and take up where he left off. The father of the bride is having nothing to do with it and breaks to Samson the bad news. "Samson, you left your bride at the altar. Tough luck, son. She married the best man." And of course, at this, Samson is more furious than he has ever been before. And in an act of wanton cruelty, in his rage, he takes foxes, sets their tails on fire, and releases them into the wheat harvest that was ready to be brought in for the Philistines. Of course, the whole of the fields begin to go up in smoke, and once that blaze is started, like a forest fire, it cannot be stopped, and it continues on until the whole harvest of the Philistines is destroyed. And now he is Philistine public enemy number 1.
You've been listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Cultivate Self-Control, part of our series Deck Chairs on the Titanic, How to Avoid Plunging to Disaster, in which we look at 8 characters from the Bible and how they allowed sin in their life to result in that plunge to disaster. If you ever miss one of the series, don't forget you can always come online to our website to catch up or go back and listen again. And that's at openthebible.org.uk. You can also find Pastor Colin's teaching on all the major podcast sites. Search for Open the Bible UK and subscribe if you want to receive regular reminders. Also on our website and available as a podcast, you can find Open the Bible Daily, and that's a series of short 2 to 3 minute daily reflections based on Pastor Colin's teaching and read in the UK by Sue McLeish. I wonder if you or your church have anything planned this Easter. Open the Bible's Amanda Cunningham is here to talk about something special from Open the Bible.
How will you reach out to your local community this Easter with the good news of the gospel? How will you inspire awe in your church family at the wonder of the cross when the story is familiar? Open the Bible UK would love to help you. We filmed a 1-actor, 1-hour performance of Colin's well-known book, Heaven, How I Got Here, the story of the thief on the cross. It's a powerful gospel message, and we're making the film available to you for free. Alongside it, we have also created a complete Easter resource pack, including event artwork and an event guide, designed as an easy evangelistic event for inviting friends or the local community, especially those hesitant about attending a church service. It's also perfect for small groups to watch and discuss during Holy Week. To find out more, go to openthebible.org.uk.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Open the Bible is supported entirely by our listeners. That's people just like you. And if that's something you haven't done to date, but if you're thinking about doing it, if you're able to begin a new direct debit in the amount of £5 per month or more, or a one-off gift of £50 or more, we'd love to thank you by sending you a copy of Pastor Colin's book, Heaven, How I Got Here, the story of the thief on the cross, and also a small booklet entitled How Can I Be Sure of Heaven?, along with an Open the Bible pen and bookmark. These items are our gift to you for beginning to support Open the Bible financially. Full details, terms and conditions are on our website, and you can give online. For Open the Bible and Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll be able to join us again next time on Open the Bible. What do you know about controlling your desires? It's in this that many Christians feel defeated. Find out why next time on Open the Bible.